It was raining that night, a slow, relentless rain that seemed to wash color out of the world. Inside the small-town funeral home in Indiana, the storm was little more than a muffled echo against the windows. The fluorescent lights hummed above the steel embalming table. The air was cold, still, and clinical. James Miller, a funeral director for 22 years, stood alone in that room. Steady hands, precise movements, the kind of man who found comfort in ritual. Death, to him, was routine, predictable, orderly, until that night. In his voiceover, James speaks with the calm of a man who has seen too much. In my line of work, he says, you think you've seen everything. Until the night a body opened its eyes. He had just begun preparing the body of Mary Evans, age 43. A nurse, a wife, a mother of 2. Her death certificate read, cardiac arrest. The hospital had delivered her remains late that afternoon. Everything about her case seemed ordinary, until the moment James removed the sheet and began his work. He describes it now, slowly, as though replaying a nightmare in fragments. The faint creak of his gloves stretching, the quiet hiss of sterilizer mist. And then a sound, barely audible. A whisper of air that did not belong. James froze, thinking it was a leak in the equipment. But it wasn't. It came from the table. The room fell silent. For a heartbeat, he swore he saw her chest rise. Just slightly. He stepped closer, his pulse hammering in his throat. A faint exhalation, like a sigh. His instruments slipped from his hand and clattered onto the floor, the metallic sound slicing through the stillness. He told himself it was impossible. He had seen post-mortem gas release before. It could make bodies shift, even emit sounds. He knew the science. But this was different. This felt deliberate. As he stood frozen, he saw something that would haunt him forever. Mary's eyelids fluttered. Just once, then again. A tremor passed through her fingers, a faint twitch that rippled like static beneath her skin. James staggered back, knocking over a tray. No, he whispered. No, that can't be. He glanced at the clock. It was just past 1:14 a.m. The power flickered. For a moment, the room went dark. When the lights came back, she was still. Completely still. But the silence no longer felt peaceful. It pressed in, thick, suffocating, alive. James later said it was the longest minute of his life. He wanted to run, but something in him refused to look away. If I left, he said, I'd always wonder what she would have done next. When he finally gathered enough courage to move, he checked again. No pulse. No warmth. The medical truth was unchanged. She was gone. And yet, something in him knew he had witnessed more than a reflex. The camera lingers on the dim light above the embalming table, casting shadows across her still face. Rain continues to whisper against the glass, steady and indifferent. James leans close to the microphone during his interview, his voice breaking slightly. I've prepared thousands, he says, but I'll never forget her. That night, something in that room was not supposed to happen. And then, silence again, heavy, deliberate, as if the air itself is holding its breath. The narration closes softly. Was it science? Was it something beyond it? Whatever it was, that night marked the beginning of the most unexplainable experience of James Miller's life. 48 hours earlier, life for Mary Evans had been ordinary, almost painfully so. A gray Tuesday morning, the kind that slips through memory unnoticed. She'd brewed coffee, packed lunch for her teenage son, and kissed her husband David goodbye before leaving for her shift at St. Luke's Medical Center. Mary was a registered nurse, the kind of woman who moved through chaos with quiet grace. Patients described her as light in the room. Her coworkers said she had a gift, a way of making people feel safe, even when nothing about the situation was. That morning, the hospital security footage captured her walking briskly through the corridor, clipboard in hand, smiling faintly. And then, everything changed. Around 9:12 a.m., she collapsed near the nurse's station. No warning, no cry for help. Just silence, and the sound of the clipboard hitting the floor. CPR began within seconds. Doctors and nurses, her colleagues, fought to bring her back. For 43 relentless minutes, they cycled through compressions, shocks, and epinephrine doses. The monitor flatlined, then flickered, then fell silent again. At 9:57 a.m., she was declared dead. The attending physician, Dr. Chen, appears in a subdued interview. There was nothing unusual about the case. No trauma, no overdose, just a massive cardiac arrest. We did everything we could. Her husband, David, remembers arriving at the hospital to see her lying motionless under a white sheet. He says, it didn't feel real. I remember touching her hand. It wasn't cold yet. I told them she was still warm, but they said that was normal. His voice cracks. But I swear to you, she wasn't gone. Not yet. The narrator's voice interweaves with the grief. To the medical staff, Mary's passing was clinical, a line drawn between heartbeat and silence. To her family, it was something far more complicated. A feeling that her departure didn't feel complete. Her death was ruled as cardiac arrest with underlying arrhythmia, nothing out of the ordinary. But hours after her body arrived at the funeral home, that feeling of incompleteness began to surface in ways no one could explain. Here, The documentary begins to explore the border between medicine and mystery. The narration slows. The doctors define death as the irreversible cessation of cardiac and brain activity. But what if that line isn't as solid as we think? What if, in rare moments, the body refuses to let go? Experts appear briefly, their tone cautious, scientific. They discuss something called Lazarus syndrome, the spontaneous return of circulation after failed resuscitation. Rare, unpredictable, and largely misunderstood. Most physicians will never witness it in their entire careers. The camera drifts across a heart monitor, the rhythmic blip fading into a straight line, then back again. The voiceover continues. In most cases, the dead remain still, but sometimes, for reasons medicine cannot yet explain, they come back, even if only for a moment. And so, we return to the question lingering over Mary's case. Was this a tragic error? A flicker of residual life missed in the chaos of a hospital morning? Or something far stranger that science has yet to name? Her story was far from over. In fact, it hadn't even truly begun. Death is supposed to be final. A line, not a question mark. But every so often that line blurs. In the sterile light of emergency rooms around the world, something quietly defies the order of biology. Patients who should remain lifeless don't. They move. They breathe. Their hearts begin again. Doctors call it the Lazarus phenomenon. Named after the biblical story of Lazarus, the man Jesus is said to have raised from the dead, the term has found a chilling foothold in modern medicine. It refers to the rare, spontaneous return of circulation after failed attempts at resuscitation. In other words, the dead coming back to life. Dr. Helena Moore, a cardiologist featured in the film, speaks with measured precision. It's extremely rare, she says. Fewer than 40 well-documented cases worldwide. But we know it's real. Her voice softens, betraying her scientific calm. It's also deeply unsettling. We see reenactments, a hospital corridor, a clock ticking on the wall. A nurse steps away from a patient whose heart is flatlined. The monitor is silent. Then, after several minutes, it begins again. A faint blip, a breath. The room erupts in confusion. Medical explanations exist, though none fully satisfy. Sometimes, trapped air pressure in the chest, caused by CPR, can temporarily prevent the heart from restarting. When the pressure releases, blood may flow again, making it seem as though life has returned. In other cases, drugs like adrenaline, given during resuscitation, may take effect later than expected, causing a delayed reaction. The narrator's voice threads through these facts with cinematic pacing. Science can describe the how, but it struggles with the why. Why does it happen to some and not others? Why, after all vital signs have ceased, does the body sometimes choose to breathe again? A neurologist, Dr. Patel, adds another layer. Even when circulation restarts, brain activity rarely does. These events don't necessarily mean consciousness returns. But it's that uncertainty, that small, impossible gray area that keeps doctors awake at night. Footage shifts to James Miller, backlit in his office. He watches old news clips about the Lazarus phenomenon, his expression unreadable. I had read about such things, he admits, voice low, but you never think it'll happen on your table. The scene cuts between him and a soft, rhythmic heartbeat. Distant, echoing, almost human. The narration grows quieter. If death can reverse itself even once, what does that mean for how we understand life? For some, these stories are proof that science still has limits. For others, they are reminders that life and death are less opposites, and more a continuum, a fragile balance of chemistry and will. And yet, as medical as it sounds, nothing prepares you for the moment it happens before your eyes. That's what James Miller experienced, a moment when theory became terrifying reality. And that moment was only the beginning. The rain hadn't stopped. By the time the clock in the funeral home read 1 a.m., the world outside was shrouded in mist, the kind that swallows streetlights and makes familiar places look unfamiliar. Inside, James Miller stood over Mary Evans's body, preparing to begin what should have been another routine embalming. The storm outside felt distant, almost irrelevant, compared to the storm about to begin within that silent room. He recalls, in a voice that trembles slightly, "I'd checked everything twice. Paperwork, tags, temperature, everything was normal. But there was something about her face. It didn't look like the others. There was still something there. I don't know what, but I felt it." The embalming room was a study in stillness. The metallic hum of the ventilation system, the faint scent of antiseptic and steel. James set his instruments neatly, one by one, his movements automatic. But then, something broke that silence. A whisper. So soft, he thought it might have come from the wind. Then it came again, a faint release of air. He froze. His eyes darted to the table. Her chest moved. Barely perceptible, but it moved. In his own words, "I thought maybe it was the air conditioning, or maybe my mind playing tricks." But then her fingers twitched. I swear to God, her fingers moved. He describes the moment with the calm of someone still trying to convince himself it happened. He reached for her wrist, cold, no pulse. But her lips seemed to part, just slightly. as though forming a word. The narration slows. He was trained to recognize post-mortem reflexes, the natural release of gases, small spasms of muscle, nothing supernatural about them, but this was different. James stumbled backward, his breathing shallow, the edges of his vision closing in. I just remember saying, "Mary?" he whispers. It was instinct. I didn't mean to speak, but something in me thought she might answer. And then another sigh, louder this time. Her chest lifted once, then fell. James dropped his tools, hands shaking, and reached for his phone. He called emergency services, his voice frantic, barely coherent. "She's breathing," he told them. "She's breathing. You have to come." Minutes later, paramedics arrived, expecting a misunderstanding. But when they entered the room, they saw it too. A faint shiver running through her arm, a low, guttural sound rising from her throat. One of them whispered, "Jesus Christ." They checked her vitals. Nothing. Her pupils didn't respond. Her skin remained cool. And yet, her body continued to tremble with subtle, rhythmic spasms, as if some buried impulse deep within her refused to stop fighting. The narrator cuts in softly. Was it a reflex? A final discharge of nervous energy? Or something else? Something that defies explanation? The paramedics transported Mary's body back to St. Luke's, where doctors ran new tests. No heartbeat. No brain activity. No oxygen flow. Technically, scientifically, she was gone. And yet, one nurse swore she saw a tear form at the corner of Mary's eye. James sat in the hospital hallway that night, staring at the tiled floor, trying to comprehend what he'd witnessed. I kept asking myself, was it her body just finishing? Or was she trying to come back? The scene fades to Mary's face in the hospital bed, motionless now, serene, as though she had finally completed something unfinished. James's voice returns. That night, I questioned everything I thought I knew about death. The narrator ends the section with quiet gravity. Between life and death, there is a moment, a breath, a whisper, a flicker, where neither science nor faith can say who's truly in control. By morning, news of what had happened in that funeral home began to spread quietly. Whispered first among hospital staff, then among the local coroner's office, and eventually throughout the small Indiana town. The official story was simple. A body had moved, breathed, and made sounds hours after death had been declared. But simplicity didn't fit the weight of what James Miller had seen. The coroner, Dr. Ann Lively, ordered an immediate review. Our responsibility, she explained in her interview, was to make sure no mistakes had been made. Medically, legally, ethically. If there was even the slightest chance this woman was alive when declared dead, that's not something you can ignore. Records were re-examined, the time of death confirmed. The procedures checked twice. Mary's vitals had been absent for nearly an hour before resuscitation was stopped. There were no signs of respiration, no measurable brain function, no cardiac activity. Every standard had been followed. Still, doubt had taken root. A nurse who had assisted in Mary's original resuscitation appeared emotional on camera. "She was one of us," she said, tears threatening to spill. "We did everything. But part of me can't stop wondering if we missed something, if she was still fighting, somewhere in there." The investigation revealed another strange fact. The embalming process hadn't yet begun when the movements occurred. That ruled out chemical reactions. The temperature of the room, the preservation timeline, all within normal limits. Post-mortem spasms? Possible, yes. But what about the exhalation? The sound of air leaving the lungs hours later? That, experts admitted, was harder to explain. Dr. Lively frowned when asked. Bodies can release gases, but coordinated movement accompanied by vocalization? That's exceptionally rare. You could live 100 years in this field and never witness it. James found himself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. Local reporters called his home. The funeral home's phone rang for days. Some accused him of embellishing the story for attention. Others believed something supernatural had occurred. "I didn't want fame," he says quietly. "I wanted answers." Psychologists weighed in, suggesting that trauma and exhaustion might distort perception. In moments of high stress, one explained, our minds can fill gaps, seeing or hearing what we fear or expect. But when paramedics confirmed faint movement upon arrival, that theory began to waver. One paramedic's body cam, reviewed later by authorities, captured something. A slight motion beneath the sheet, the faintest ripple. It wasn't proof of life, but it wasn't stillness either. Ultimately, the official conclusion was unsatisfying. No further inquiry. Mary Evans's file was closed, her death certificate unchanged. No negligence, no error, no clear cause for what James witnessed. Yet, in interviews filmed months later, his eyes still drift toward the floor when he speaks of that night. "They can close their files all they want," he says softly. "But that door in my mind, it never shut." And so, even when the paperwork said, "Case closed," the story of Mary Evans refused to rest. Months passed, but for James Miller, time didn't move the way it used to. The days bled together in the dim light of the funeral home, and the nights were the hardest. That room, the embalming room, had become different. It wasn't just a workspace anymore. It felt alive, like something had stayed behind the night Mary Evans moved. He tried to dismiss it as imagination, a trick of fatigue or stress, but then the dreams began. He describes them in the tone of a man who's afraid of sounding insane. At first, it was just flashes, he says. Her face, the table, the lights. But then it became more. I'd see her standing there at the foot of the table, whispering. I could never make out the words except once. Once, it sounded like she said, "Tell them I wasn't gone." In those dreams, she wasn't frightening. There was no malice, no horror movie apparition. Just presence, something unfinished, a shadow of the unanswered. James would wake drenched in sweat, her name echoing in his mind like a memory that refused to fade. He went back to work because he had to. Funerals didn't wait for grief. Families came in, tearful and fragile. And James did what he'd always done, offered comfort, quiet professionalism, dignity for the departed. But something inside him had shifted. It's not the bodies that haunt me, he confides in voiceover. It's the silence. I listen to it now, differently, like I'm waiting for something to happen again. The narration weaves his experience with expert commentary. A neurologist explains that during cardiac arrest, brain activity doesn't always stop instantly. Some residual patterns can persist for minutes, even longer, in what scientists call terminal bursts, the flickers of neural electricity that might momentarily bridge the gap between life and death. A theologian offers another perspective. Across cultures, he says, there's a belief that the soul doesn't depart the body instantly. Some traditions say it lingers for days, watching, waiting. Maybe that's what he saw. The body's farewell, or the spirit's. James doesn't claim to know which is true. He only knows that since that night, he feels death differently. Not as an ending, but as a threshold. There's this moment, he says, just before you declare someone gone. It's quiet, too quiet. And I keep thinking, what if in that quiet they can still hear us? The film lingers on haunting imagery, a candle flickering beside an empty coffin, dust floating through beams of morning light, a heartbeat sound dissolving into stillness. The narrator reflects, perhaps the real mystery isn't whether Mary came back to life, but whether she ever truly left. James visits Mary's grave 1 year later. He brings flowers, white lilies, and sets them down with trembling hands. I don't know what happened that night, he says softly, his voice breaking, but I hope you found peace. I hope we both do. The scene fades with him walking away from the grave, the camera lingering on the wind stirring the petals, a quiet, almost imperceptible movement. For James, life after Mary became less about death and more about the space between, the fragile, beautiful moment when breath becomes memory, and memory refuses to die. Morning light filters through the stained glass windows of the chapel at Miller & Sons Funeral Home. Dust dances in the beams of sunlight, and for the first time in a long while, the air feels gentle. James Miller sits alone in the front pew, hands clasped, head bowed. His voice, quiet and reflective, carries the weight of everything that came before. Maybe Mary came back for a reason, he says. Maybe not, but she reminded me life is more fragile and more mysterious than I ever wanted to believe. The camera lingers on the details. The scuffed floor beneath his shoes, the worn pages of a small prayer book, the clock ticking softly on the far wall. It's the same world it's always been, and yet everything in it feels changed. Through narration, we hear that James still works in the same funeral home, still guides families through grief, still speaks softly when he closes the casket lid. But there's something new in his presence now, a stillness, almost reverence, that comes from knowing death isn't the hard line he once thought it was. We return briefly to Mary's story. Her husband David appears one final time. His face is calmer now, aged slightly by grief, but peaceful. I used to ask why her, he says, but now I just think maybe she was trying to show us something we weren't ready to see. Doctors from earlier in the documentary reappear for their final thoughts. Dr. Helena Moore, the cardiologist, looks directly into the camera. Medicine is about facts, she says, but sometimes facts are only part of the picture. There are still things the human body and the human spirit can do that we don't understand. Then, a priest interviewed throughout the film offers his own reflection. Perhaps death is not a wall, he says softly, but a doorway. And sometimes the door doesn't close right away. The narration slows, allowing each word to sink in. For most of us, death is something we fear, the great unknown. But for James Miller, it became a reminder of something sacred, that what separates life from whatever comes next might not be darkness, but a whisper. We see James walking down the chapel aisle toward the door, the sunlight outlining him in gold. His voice returns, steady now, free of the trembling that filled his earlier interviews. I still hear the hum of that room, he says. I still see her face, but now I'm not afraid of the quiet anymore. As he steps outside, the camera captures the Indiana morning. Mist rising from the fields, birds beginning to stir. It's peaceful, almost cleansing. The final narration ties it together, gentle but haunting. In every life, there are moments we can't explain. Moments that refuse to fit into charts or theories. They live in the space between breath and silence, between what we know and what we can only feel. For James Miller, that space will always belong to one woman who wasn't ready to go. The screen fades to black. A faint heartbeat echoes once, then fades into nothing. White text appears against the silence. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only respected